Сейчас начинаем. Во-первых, Lena.
We begin our deliberations.
Опять обращаю.
So I'd like to appeal to attention, please. Let's sit down, make ourselves comfortable. I want you to meet. So our task is. Our meeting, the whole meeting today is the whole point. So be ready because we'll be appealing to you, urging you to participate in this discussion actively, and even if some of you have not read books, so I'm sure that you will have thought about the subject matter that is the topic of our discussion. So because I'm sure that you've given much thought to it, and the book just puts it through a different prism, and that is why this field of possibilities to make comments. But we'll be expecting your comments and your questions. And now I would like to give the floor to Andrei Kolesnikov, who is our school expert. And he is not speaking at this seminar, so he was going just to speak only at this session. But at the same, he's the chief editor of a paper that is called New Paper, Novaya Gazeta. And, it's not Russia Today. It's a new Russia. It's a different paper. And I over to him, and he's certainly quite a known. So I'm give information to Zach and to Jan. So he's one of our leading, wonderful journalists. So this is for your information, friends, because whenever we see his printed articles, we always go for them because he's a very cultured journalist, and there's a lot of literally cultural associations that bespeak his well-read nature. So usually people start claiming that he is not working in the field and not in hot spots where people shoot. I'm not the chief editor of. Yes, I am the associate editor, and this is just one step lower, so considerably lower. I did not expect that they will start with me. This session was Jan McHugh, and I thought that he would be the first to speak, and I did not expect that. And so the topic open for discussion is quite wide. But certainly against the background of the recent events, so this topic, this personal freedom topic, has become even more pertinent, and personal responsibility has become more pertinent as well. Our country. Just almost like the Soviet Union, so does not think itself outside the state. So that's why this space of personal space is shrinking, and so the space of private actions is shrinking as well. So it's getting narrower and narrower, and so that's the main challenge. So even when we interpret the civic society by the civic society, even there's interpretation. So this notion of the civil society is shrinking, and the notion of freedom is shrinking because I thought that freedom and civil society always should be associated with NGOs, with such structures, because that would be more natural, because the civil society consists of a number of persons, of individuals who are the carers, bearers of this private freedom. But the private person just should not only have the right just to participate in civil life, but should have the right not to participate in certain. Because if a person is free, and so this is the clear delineation of Vladimir Nabokov. So he is the epitome of freedom, personal freedom, as hero, because he participated. He was a member only of one club. That was a tennis club. That was the only club membership that he had. And so a person should be responsible for himself and for his family. And if he does, that's already sufficient to become a member of the civil society. So certainly just in the present-day terminology, definition, so we talk about opposition. We always just oppose the civil society and the state, diametrically opposite. But this is the situation. Because the state is encroaching onto the civil society, becomes monopolistic, and so trying to be monopolist in civil cases, in civil events. So it has to be everywhere in the economy. So this total encroachment, the total advance of the state, certainly generates a counteraction of the civil society, or the real civil society, because they want just to build the real civil society, not the quasi-civil society that the state is trying just to adjust to its own needs. And we all know the most recent, the law on the formation of, the most recent law on the formation of, what's the name, I forgot. Okay, any law that, what was called, so the people's militia. So when ordinary civilians just would wear bands on the sleeves, and also when they replace police, so they patrol the streets. So that's an attempt to create the structure of civil society, but under control of the state, the way it was in the Soviet Union. So because those people's druzhinas so were regulated by the Central Communist Party decree, so in 1957, and it's reproduced in the same form and shape so from the Soviet matrix. So then the news of today, so then when the intrusion of the state in the sphere of free historic science, so that's another so free encroachment freedom. So then there is a law that you cannot discuss certain things about World War II. So then the law which forbids discussion about World War II. So because it's not only because they so propaganda of Nazism, so it's banned by the state, but even they banned to discuss the actions of the Soviet Union during World War II. So, for example, simple question, for example, so whether the Soviet soldiers raped the German women when they were in Germany. So this question should not be discussed because it will be libel, and it will be a denigration of the Soviet troops, and this was approved by the State Duma. And this intrusion in all private, so starting from adopting children and to the interpretation of the historic events, is catastrophic for the people's conscience. So you will look at the sociological polls. So they take this intrusion invasion in stride, and they don't think it's so bad, because this intrusion is. So when into people's thinking, into people's subconscious, into people's private lives, who still have capability to think. Those who can't think, and there are quite a few, because they don't care about these new laws, about new adoption of these rigid new things, intrusions into private life. They just don't care because they are not used to think. And so because the Soviet, the Russians now are interested only in their consumer basket, and as long as they have the consumer basket, as long as they get their salaries and wages, and as long as they get their consumer lending and they get their clothing, and as long as this basket does not diminish, and as long as they do not suffering from starvation, so then an ordinary person will not think much about what's happening outside his consumption basket. Then another point for any characteristic of any civil society is understanding of common cause, res publica. So common cause, res publica, res publica, common cause. And unfortunately, in Russia, for this society, so the trust is very narrow, and the social capital level is very low, scientifically speaking, and very murky understanding of what is common cause for Russia. And so when they form the idea what common cause is, so the state starts to formulate that instead of the people. So then the only res publica was the annexation of Crimea. And this is the only common cause that united or rallied everyone just under the banners. And so 90% of the population, as polled, so people thought consolidated. So Putin is right. So they, instead of stability, so they got consolidation. There is no stability, but there is consolidation around this common cause. And people are very patriotic, and so this common cause so was just against the background of the annexation. So not just helping the neighbor, not helping the disabled, so these microscopic things that exist elsewhere in other civil societies, so no other just a spiritual idea, ideological idea, but just Crimea accession to Russia. And because it reproduces this matrix, so the orthodoxy, nationality, and imperiality. So the three principles of the imperial Russia. So things like Crimea, that works because that unites people. Because if there were no Crimea, then it should have been invented. So in order to continue this expansion of the state, to revive and support so the foundation of this political regime, the way it has formed, has taken shape in the last 15 years that Putin has been in power. That is why so this space, this ambience of personal freedom is shrinking. So the personal responsibility is by a person is delegated to the state. So the state gets empowered for this, devolved to the state. So we provide you services, we give you an average level of income, and then in exchange you abandon your. So this covenant works again. This public agreement works, social agreement, and you don't have any other aspirations. And so the small number of thinking people, which has further shrunk recently, sociology shows that, because there are very few protests, very little discontent. And so this, so that is why the state can so tell us how we need to live. So discussions, so that we have here. These discussions, the debates, so can take place like in the Soviet times in the kitchens, so where people speak their minds. And politically, personal freedoms. So then we can the Russian person cannot put anything against the state. Then at the level of discussions, they certainly can argue with the state. At the level of discussions, pronouncements, making participating in making clean breast of things, speaking their minds, so delivering their private personal stand. But this is the only optimistic level, the conclusion that I can make concerning what's been happening recently. John Lloyd, and you know him so well. So he's a journalist of another paper, so which is called Financial Times, but he is the chairman of the board of our school, and he actually organized this meeting. So he brought the writers here. So thank you. Mm-hmm.
Discussion we started before the break, and this time we start with Ian McEwan.
Thank you, John. Let me start by bringing you some gossip from London about your president. There's nothing wrong with gossip. The evaluation of the motives of other people is something I think that is one of the most enticing forms of conversation that exists. And some people refer to the novel as a form of higher gossip. So with that kind of excuse, one of my friends in London is a very well-known historian. He's now in his late 80s. He's called Alistair Horn. And he is a close friend of Henry Kissinger. And Kissinger had a significant birthday not so long ago, and an American oligarch offered him 20 hours of flying time in his private plane. And my friend Alistair said to Kissinger, "Oh, well, in that case, you must come and visit me in England." And he said, "No, I've already used up my 20 hours flying to Moscow." And to my amazement, Kissinger and Putin are quite close. And Kissinger then told Alistair Horn of a meeting some years ago. They sat in an enormous room alone together in the Kremlin, facing each other across a desk. And the president said to Henry Kissinger, "Mr. Kissinger, what do you think are my most important problems in Russia?" And Kissinger slapped his forehead and said, "Oh, you have many, many problems. But the biggest problem you have are your borders. To your west, you have an expanding NATO. To your east, you have a China that can never be trusted and is ruthless even as an ally. To your south, you have Islamic extremism and breakaway groups who do terrible things even to school children. But," said Kissinger, "you have one border that you need never worry about. And that is the mental border, the nominal border between the United States and Russia. At which point, according to Kissinger, your president's eyes filled with tears, and he came round the desk and embraced Henry Kissinger." It seems now that the time for such embraces is over. One of the distinguishing features, I think, of everything I've heard today has been, and just now too, in very eloquent terms, very dark mood, a very strong sense of the personal sphere, the private space, the civic society being pressured. It could well be that we enter another form of Cold War. Already on many levels of engagement between East and West, there have been significant withdrawals, not only with G8, but at many, many lower levels, less noticed. And I rather wish to go back to the beginning of the last Cold War, because it had extraordinary consequences for literary culture in the West, as well as here, of course, but in very different terms. And I want to describe to you a very significant conference that took place on the 25th of March, 1949, in Manhattan, in New York, in a grand hotel called the Waldorf Astoria. Nearest equivalent, I'd say, in Moscow is the Ukraina Hotel. Very grand, marble halls. 1,000 delegates came from all over the world. The conference was organized by the Soviet Union, by Cominform, and it was called the Conference for Scientific and Cultural Dialogue, a very grand sort of title that no one could object to, but many people in the United States did object. On that cold, slightly windy day, outside the conference hall were nuns and priests protesting, and various rather sort of loony American right-wingers. In the delegate hall, as I said, people come from all over the world, but what's of interest here are the American delegates. a number of American eminent left-wingers. Lillian Hellman was there, Clifford Odets, film star, Leonard Bernstein. They were suspicious that the US government, which only 2 or 3 years before had persuaded everyone that Uncle Joe, as everyone referred to Stalin, was a cozy, cuddly figure and was now a demon. They were asked now to dislike an ally and now was being demonized. And they were worried too about an arms race. But more significantly, they were prepared to overlook the news that was beginning to come about the Gulag. They were prepared to forget about the show trials or the Nazi-Soviet pact. So the conference began. The most important delegate there from the Soviet Union was Shostakovich. Shostakovich was there on Stalin's invitation, an invitation clearly that Shostakovich was not going to risk refusing. Now, if you mentally cross that marble lobby and get into the elevator and go onto the 10th floor and enter the best room in the Waldorf Astoria, certainly the biggest room, the bridal suite, room 1045, you would have seen a most extraordinary scene. Telephone cables, teleprinters, cigarette smoke so thick you could barely see across the room, people talking urgently on the phone, people typing press releases. This was what came to be known to the CIA as the non-communist left. And they were determined to undermine the conference with press releases. They were well connected. There was a constant flow of martinis, champagne, wine, steaks, hamburgers, and a general level of furious activity. There came a point in one session in the conference before 1,000 delegates when Nicholas Nabokov, who himself was a composer, asked Shostakovich whether he agreed with a Pravda editorial which condemned the work of Stravinsky and Hindemith and Schoenberg as worthless bourgeois formalism, and that they were capitalist lackeys. Shostakovich had on either side of him his KGB minders. He had a whispered consultation with them, and he rose to his feet and said in a very quiet voice, "I agree with Pravda." Now, it was a very unfair question. Nicholas Nabokov had all the freedoms in the world. Shostakovich was completely hemmed in. He was not there of his own free choice. He risked death by refusing to go. He certainly risked a great deal, or his family would suffer if he gave the wrong answer. Generally, the people upstairs on the 10th floor with their press releases managed to generate a very hostile press to what was in fact, of course, a Soviet front, and the conference generally was condemned all across the United States, massive editorials in all the main newspapers dismissing it as pure propaganda. Now, only 2 people in that room on the 10th floor knew who was paying for the steaks and the martinis. One of them was called Sidney Hook. Another was called Melvin Lasky. The whole operation was funded by the CIA. The people who were working in that room certainly were not told by any operatives of the CIA what to say. They themselves were considered themselves to be free agents. But it set the tone for one of the most remarkable chapters in cultural life. Because at that point, the CIA saw it had a winner. The non-communist left would be the most effective instrument that it could motivate in the Cold War. Via the Marshall Plan, the CIA had access to 5% of the total funds lodged in various banks in different countries, and huge quantities of money were then spent over the next 20, 30, 40 years. And extraordinarily, many members of the CIA were professors of Yale, Harvard. They had extremely good taste. So in secret, using fronts like the Congress of Cultural Freedom, the Boston Symphony Orchestra, American jazz players and singers, American abstract expressionists, toured Europe. The whole point was to persuade left-of-center European intellectuals that America had a culture, or the West had a culture that could stand up to anything and anything in the war of ideas. It was to try and persuade, especially in Italy and France, where the PCI and the PFI, the local communist parties of those countries, were quite strong. So trying to wean the intelligentsia away from this lingering idea that still the future lay in, and it's an idea that took a long time to die in the West, that the Soviet future was the future for mankind that we should all aspire to. The cultural Cold War tore the literary world apart. It was a long and bitter and divisive struggle, and it only slowly faded. Literary magazines were set up. One of them, a very famous one in the Anglophone world, was called Encounter. In Germany, there was a magazine called Der Monat. In France, there was L'Épreuve. These magazines, unknown to those who worked for them, wrote for them, were entirely funded through their fronts by the CIA and to some extent by the British Secret Service, MI5 and MI6. It had a distorting effect on cultural life because slowly it came out. It was bound to come out sooner or later. In fact, it came out in a magazine article in 1967 about the extent of this infiltration and funding, and then a much bigger article, a more important article in the New York Times in 1968. It fascinates me, and it's what drew me into writing the last novel that I published, called Sweet Tooth, because it suggests something to us about institutions. There are many who would quite reasonably say that not one of those writers who was published in Der Monat or Encounter was doing anything other than what they would do. This was the This was the anti-totalitarian left, trying to make the case for socialism or for democratic socialism against the example of the Soviet Union. On the other hand, the question has to be posed, if you wish to argue for an open society, if you wish to make the case for freedom of assembly, freedom of expression, all the freedoms that we aspire to in this room, why on earth do it in secret? Why do it through the CIA? And the answer, I think, has something to do with all institutions. There's generally, I think, a law of institutions, is they always wish to get bigger. Every successful human institution wishes to get more powerful and larger and to extend its reach. The CIA had the money to do this. Writers found themselves invited to conferences and wondered why they were flying first class. No novelist, no poet ever traveled first class. And slowly it became apparent, and it caused immense bitterness and demoralization across literary communities in all Western countries. So it's to me, in the inception of the novel Sweet Tooth, was a paradox that I couldn't resist. One of the most significant figures who would have, I think, made a huge impact in the Cold War, or he already did, of course, was George Orwell. Orwell's experiences in the Spanish Civil War turned him into a deadly enemy of the Soviet Union and of totalitarianism in general. His reputation has been fought over by left and right, but the fact is that within intellectual circles in the 1940s, late 30s and 1940s, in Britain, for example, he was very much hated by significant figures on the left who felt that he was betraying a cause. Interestingly, Victor Galantz turned down Animal Farm. He was attacked quite savagely. When he was dying, he was approached by MI6 to suggest a list of writers that he thought MI6 or the Foreign Office should not approach if they wanted to make a strong anti-totalitarian message. And one of the great, again, debating points and possible stains, some people would see it as a stain, some do not, on Orwell's reputation is he supplied the Foreign Office with a list of writers and intellectuals whom he thought were either fellow travelers with the Soviet project or were people who could not be trusted and shouldn't be approached in the first place. So it's this extraordinary twisting of the culture that invades the space, I think, of the imagination. If one were to be truly pessimistic and indulge the fantasy that we are going to drift into some other form of Cold War, it won't be the same, the ideology is all different, but still we can imagine a kind of embattlement. If one was to indulge that pessimism for a moment, what happens in the West? Well, Western Europe is a postmodern world of, what concerns us: climate change, rights for children, for women, for gays. Interestingly, nominated as forms of decadence by the Putin mindset. It's a long time since people thought of NATO as having anything to do with European security. Now we've moved into a world in which there are troop movements onto the Polish border, up to Lithuania, talk in Germany of boosting military expenditure. This is already, before we've hardly moved down this trail of chaos. Two consequences, I think, are important. One is a huge shift from social spending to military. Will happen in the West as well as here. And the other thing, which one would normally like to think of as a good thing, but in fact I think it's a consequence of many bad things, becomes the extraordinary importance of the free imagination. I went a lot during the Cold War to speak with friends in Czechoslovakia and Poland. They lived a shadowy life. It wasn't quite as severe as here for dissident writers. But after '89, many of those same friends, although they were, of course, elated by the fall of the Berlin Wall, suffered a real sense of growing irrelevance, that their free imaginations had taken on colossal importance, and that was, over the years, especially into the 90s, began to ebb from them. But the fact remains that the free imagination during the Cold War, this last one, therefore the next one, if it should happen, and I hope it doesn't, the crucial lifeline will be exactly the spirit of what's around this table, exactly the sense of people patrolling, as it were, the borders of civil society and the privilege, the civilization-forming privilege of letting imaginative minds free, either to criticize the state or to withdraw into the private life and examine whatever it is that wherever their fantasies take us. Thank you.
Ian, thank you very much. We have here a distinguished historian of the Cold War, Vlad Zubok. Let me ask him to say 2 or 3 words.
Okay. I need a mic or...
Come and use this one.
О, спасибо. Я буду говорить по-русски.
I shall speak Russian. Well, the topic that Ian touched is indeed very deep, and we can ask ourselves a question of the following character, following nature. We are starting the era of some strange, mysterious, unknown Cold War. Can we compare it to the Cold War that has been ongoing over the last 25 years and been studied through documents, through memoirs and diaries, whatever? So I believe that culture-wise, what was the difference, what was the specifics of the previous conventional Cold War with the new, fresh one? That one was a toddler war, a baby war. This one is still a baby war. We hope it will not learn how to walk. So at that time, we were talking about fight for Europe primarily. And this fight over Europe was made under the banner of European culture. Americans were portraying themselves as saviors of Europe, who were pouring in the new blood into the old, dilapidated Europe, being an offspring of European culture. But the same thing was done by the Soviet Union. In any way, the Soviet culture propaganda, whatever was done under the banner of saving the European culture, and then from aggressive Americanism and pop and abstract art, decadence and all that sort of saving Europe, preserving the treasures of European culture, cultural values, and European treasure trove. And the second thing that Ian pointed out, I believe the key, the fighting for intelligentsia. So let's just forget the question, what is intelligentsia and how you understand it. But this is fight for intellectual and cultural elite of Europe, part of which, well, American writers consider themselves to be part of, and even the Soviet. And musicians and writers and artists. That's why huge attention and state budget was spent to this intelligentsia. But in fact, there was difference. In case of West, we were talking about creating institutions, by the way, that were non-existent until 1947. The CIA exists since 1947, that would support and reinforce those institutional structures of those few thinkers like Orwell, Koestler, Czeslaw Milosz, and other people freed from the Soviet from the totalitarian chains. And if we take a Soviet study, we had Simonov, who believed that this cultural war should be addressed, but there were people like Shostakovich who were forced and cursed by fear to participate in this war under orders or personal request of Mr. Stalin, Comrade Stalin, personal request. I believe that what is emerging now cannot be analyzed with those old parameters. First, we're not fighting for Europe. no, the fight is not over Europe. Recently, it seemed to be because Putin said from the first hand said that Russia is a protector and treasurer of the conservative, conventional European values, and for several years. But then the shift that happened several months ago just thrown out this topic into the sewage. I don't know how we can describe what happens, but it's not the fight for over a place in Europe, in culturally, but it is understanding, awareness that Europe has kicked us out. We do not fit in. We do not shape in. Okay. Just let it be. So we don't know what's behind this let it be. So the second thing I want to pay attention is lack in this fight, absence of putting the stake at intelligence. Just the opposite, exactly the opposite, both in the West and on the part of Russia in present recent conflicts. The content is information wars, but not about the fact that a prominent writer or a publicist will write a wonderful book, Orwell-like 1984, that will survive decades. Who remembers the CIA instructions on manuals on cultural war? Probably it's a fake, and it did not exist. But Orwell is read and remembered, and there are no more Orwells. There are information wars. Russia Today and BBC that I used to love, that unfortunately dropped the plank and stopped inviting experts and intellectuals and invite the same people who are tuned to participate in information wars. So what does it mean for those who speaks about intelligence in Russia? Very deep and loaded question. I do not claim to elucidate. I will just speak about three things that seem important to me and that I believe turn people here kind of into moral crisis, pessimism, and a feeling of utter loss. Russian society demonstrates more love to fairness than to law, to law and order. This is not new, but most of the people, the latest events, believes that Crimea, it was fair to annex the Crimea. It's not by law, but who cares? And this definitely causes the crisis of people who think they understand the reality better. The other thing that has not been elucidated over the last 20 years, money. Huge role of finance, power of money, horrible, horrendous power of money that just snowballed in an unprepared Russian society. And in front of our eyes, it breaks, twists our relations to our friends, next of kin. So just plowing the land of our society. Probably it's okay, the power of money for the British, but for us it's something new. That's a huge issue. That's a crisis that we have not yet discussed deeply. And finally, third is national identity or consciousness, whatever, identity, I guess. So there is much literature about the way that Russia has covered in terms of patriotism and national identity, I guess. Conscientiousness, identity. So I believe the state we're in now is the new. It's for the first time. This nationalistic euphoria is the unity of 90% is for the first time. Some people compare it to the situation before the First World War. But most of the people then were semi-literate, illiterate peasants who were shouting, "Hooray, let's go beat Germans for the Tsar." But now the society is different. Literate and knowledgeable, operating different notions, and now we have an issue of national identity and its twists in the minds. This cause lots of pessimism and uncertainty because we don't know what to do about this phenomena and how to discuss it. So I'm sorry for being long-winded. I'm done. So, with us, we have chief editor of the Foreign Literature magazine, Alexander Vivergant. The floor is yours. Thank you. Our panel is called Personal Freedom and Personal Responsibility. And if I would draft the agenda of our meeting, I will probably replace and by or. I would say personal freedom or personal responsibility. And I can explain myself. Well, personal freedoms is coveted by everyone, but no one wants to be personally responsible. So the issue is that most of the people counterimpose something that is absolutely connectable. We all want to be free, but we don't want to be responsible for that. So we heard today many speeches about what happened last February in Ukraine and in Russia, and spoken about just like the total all nation support of the government's policy, Russian government's policy. So it happens partially because the people who raise their hands this way would be relieved from all responsibility. Responsibility is a way to have your own opinion. And when you just waive your responsibility and your own opinion, so partially your life becomes easier. You feel lighter. So let me say a few words about this strange paradox and binomial freedom, or I insist on or in literature. Any new event in literature was accepting and praising personal freedoms, but refusing responsibilities. Remember the manifestos of futurists, surrealists, and so much freedom. The whole world, at least the cultural world, belonged to them. Any responsibility? None. Never. And lack of responsibility and unwillingness to take responsibility was, in a way, a principle of their cultural policy. They were shaking their arms and swords and praising this absence of responsibility. And let me switch to the topic that probably is closer to my heart, and so-called thick magazines in our current cultural life. So a thick magazine probably is not exactly clear to my foreign colleagues, but in the Soviet time it was indeed a powerful ideological tool. And they were loved, praised, appreciated, and a wonderful thing happened. Now they say, oh, it's so wonderful and easy to publish a thick magazine. Fat magazines are more difficult to publish, not because the circulation drop, not because the readers are lazy to read, and most of them have more other interests away from those many pages magazines. And today the authors are probably the only subscribers for those magazines. And it happens due to a very simple reason. Why today it is so difficult to publish those many pages thick magazines. And it goes absolutely in line with our topic today. In the Soviet time, the freedom to publish was none. No, there was no freedom. And sometimes you had to go to be called to the carpet, to be called out to the cultural department of the Central Committee of the Soviet Party. Some issues would be returned. Many authors who would try to publish were banned because they spoke up against the policy of the Soviet Union. But what was wonderful, the editors of the thick magazines had no freedom and no responsibility. He could always explain. He was in a position to explain to his partner or wife or a friend that he's not the one to blame. He's not to blame. He has no connection with the policy of his magazine. What would you do if you were me? He would say. You'd just be, and today, without blowing out the role. So the responsibility is very high of the editor. Simple reason that we decide what to publish. It's up to us to decide what to publish. And in our case, this kind of union, opposition union, becomes a union of connection, and this is a real burden for. Thank you. Who? Habib Magomedov, Dagestan, graduate 2005. So we have a famous saying, people who read the books will always manage those, will always govern those who watch the TV. And in view of the cultural code changes, so now the video clip thinking is prevalent on Earth. So could you please tell me, what's the future of the thick magazines and literature in Russian and foreign languages, including being the resource of political upbringing and education of the citizens? If you ask me, I shall tell you. It may seem strange that the chief editor of the foreign literature magazine says that his magazine has no future, but I should tell you that this is close to the truth. This is not far from it. As for political future, the thick magazines do not have it even now. And nobody expects them to have one. And many thick magazines, I believe, and my magazine, at least has not deteriorated. At least I flipped through all the issues from the 1970s, and I feel this political pressure manifesting just, for instance, November 11 was impossible to read, just like April issue, because the first was about the October Revolution and the second about Lenin's birthday on the 22nd of April. And for those issues to be the way they should be, and in order to publish Graham Greene in other issues, we had to sacrifice a lot, like 2 issues in April and October. And in this respect, the thick magazines are much more interesting, but that's ironic. But the new free policy, when the magazines, thick magazines, became really free and interesting, independent, the interest of the public has dwindled. Why? Yes, it still exists at the level of 3,000, 4,000, 5,000 of circulation of subscribers. Why this interest has disappeared? Because the society, just like any child, any teenager, has more pronounced interests and simpler ones. Imagine you give your son a little toy car or take him for a ride on a Merc. He will probably prefer the real Mercedes. So that's probably the correlation between the thick magazine and TV. And people have no time left for reading serious literature or thick magazines, thick journals. So I have to give you a definite answer. Virtually no future. Thank you. The first round of questions.
Ask you, it connects to Ian's worry about a possible return of the cultural Cold War. A great part of the cultural Cold War, at least on the part of the CIA, was to fight against a demonizing of a culture that was distant, other, and alien. Will the internet and the World Wide Web make it harder to demonize the other side? Access to the cultures of all different peoples seems to me to be likely to diffuse the possibility of turning your opponent into an alien. Do you feel this at all? Is this true?
Все понятно?
Was it that clear? Did you? About Artyuzha from Karachaevo-Cherkessia 2010. I believe that demonization is impossible in the internet age, because without having information about the other party, the other point of view, only we can turn shadows into demons. But when we live in a common information space and effectively each other's cultural life is intertwined, in this case it's impossible. I believe you can.
Roman Pluto from Krasnodar, alumnus of 2007. I think that demonization, as it is being determined by the development of the modern media, we can see how such paranoid feelings and sentiments may indeed cover big masses of people in virtually no time, and there is an inherent danger in this speed of how information is disseminated. This can be seen on the example of web blogs, internet media, internet TV, and so on. So I think it's a double-edged sword. When with the Moscow School we arrived in the United States, we were waiting. We had to go through a procedure at the customs. There was a long interview. This was a couple of years ago. So there was an interview with Garry Kasparov, the chess champion turned into an oppositionary politician. So he was having this interview on the TV, and I was hearing things about Russia that I never hear in Russia. So at that time, we could see already a shift from the 1990s. And when I got back to Russia, I can see that there is that all media are very anti-Western. Now, the journalists, after all, follow the lead of who pays them and who hires them. This is what we can see on the example of many countries, and the distortion of information is often dictated by the great spreading and dissemination of media, whereas in the past one could read a book and have time with the erratic and very hectic rate of life that we're saying today brings us closer to Orwell's dystopias. So I think that we can see this almost infernal in nature. Thank you. Vladimir Shmilov, Moscow. Zakaria, to try and answer your question, to me it is clear that in the recent years we've been seeing the the demolishing of the myth whereby the internet was believed to be a paragon of freedom, and that totalitarianism would never encroach on the civil liberties in the era of information technologies and the internet coverage, which apparently turns to be not true. The practical experience of the recent years show that under the information abundance and freedom, propaganda can well use these instruments and even become more efficient than under the conventional informational sources, when information was dosed through prescribed channels. And it seems to me that this annihilation of this myth is quite clear, because the technologies, and internet is nothing but a technology, it's a medium. It appears that in some way the media, like the internet, may undermine the content, which is also what we're saying. I'm not trying to sound retrograde or too conservative, but it feels that the technological advances may encroach upon what we arbitrarily call philosophical content of our life, or human life. The book, the novel of George Orwell, is not about a totalitarian regime of the 20th century. It is not about communism or Nazism. And no, it is a book about totalitarianism which is yet to come. Because George Orwell, I think, his book conceives a lot more sophisticated media than those used by the totalitarian regimes of the 20th century, which makes the book even more frightening. So in this sense, I have no illusions about that. Pavel Sirotin from Voronezh. An observation I would like to make. May sound contradictory, but the events in the Ukraine that we've been seeing over the past month and a half, the news reels, the blogs, the text, the abundance of texts. I have several hundreds of contacts on the Facebook, and I can see two trends among those who are writing in my Facebook wall. There are those who are pro-Russian in the sense that the Russian state is deemed to be right, and the user, after all, is picking up those materials and the articles in the internet which confirm or support his or her views. On the other hand, there are those who can be in the opposition to the regime, and yet again, such a user can find an article or written materials that would support his or her views. So the constructs are, in this sense, the internet, even though it is permeating the entire society, does not seem to influence much the true psychological state of minds, because people always seek and find there what they seem to be convenient. Natalia Volodina from Chuvash Republic, alumnus of 2002. Your question about the cultural war, Cold Wars, what is the outlook or what is the possibility of such a war? As a person who lives in Russia, and what I've been saying, in the past 40 years, the migration flow from Russia and inter-Russia have been very important to the further development. The internet is also the internet and the information technologies would certainly impede the development of such escalation of such a cultural war. I was in Iran in 2005, and I saw how internet can be curtailed by the government. So indeed, I think that Iron Curtain and the Iron Curtain in the internet is still possible. I think that technologically it is still possible to use internet as a medium for demonization, exactly for the purpose. My generation and the generation of my parents have lived through true wars and cold wars, and I know that my children have lived for 30 years without war. My grandchildren are now 10 and 9, and I have this tragic feeling that why on earth should we again be reverting to these cliches and to the military rhetoric? Is this some kind of a trial that we are again facing? This is very tragic, and we do not know how to prevent this. So I really seek the divine help in not allowing the world to slip into yet another conflict. Thank you. Andrei Kolesnikov. Well, the question started with the internet in a way, or we veered into internet. The internet not only destroys the borders, or the boundaries, but it also creates and erects borders and walls. And also the internet is generally, or can be, a very aggressive environment, harboring the hate language. So in this sense, the internet does play a negative role in exacerbation of conflicts. So on the other hand, in this sense, I would not support the idea of internet being the propagator of freedoms. We in Russia live in a European. We have a European lifestyle. This is clear. We watch American films. We read European books. We dress like Europeans. We eat like Europeans. And yet that does not preclude us from anti-Western sentiments. Well, I graduated from school in the beginning of the 80s. How could an amateur of the Beatles songs be anti-Western? But Mr. Sergei Ivanov, who has an excellent command of English and Swedish and is known to be a great aficionado of Beatles songs, is one of the greatest proponents of anti-Western sentiments in the current Russian government. Well, thank you for this exchange.
Well, the only thing I can say is, how could I ever have expected any optimism? That's all, aside from the one fellow there. But there are absolutely good reasons for your pessimism about the internet. I just wondered about it. And you're not very encouraging.
Так, не все пессимист. Кто дальше?
Николай Борячев, Москва.
Nikolai Borisenko from Moscow. As far as the internet is concerned,
скажем так,
I think that a hoodlum wins or a bully wins in every place where there are no rules. If there are no rules. And the hoodlums, the hooligans, may well have an upper hand in the internet. I'm lucky. When I can deriving from my personal experience of a journalist, a news reporter is different from propaganda men, is more romantic. A propaganda man is more cynical. So in this sense, there is an elementary point. Preparation of content is most important, and those who come technologies of media, technologies, the spin doctoring is in the basis of every propaganda. So in this sense, we have a chance we still have a chance, we all have a chance. The internet is a very good illustration of how the civilization shrinks. Anonymity is not a particularly good thing. If you're a gentleman, then one should be responsible for one's words. And in this sense, this universal anonymity in the internet can be harmful. Ilya Shumanov, alumnus of 2010, Kaliningrad. A couple of words about the internet. We've been discussing this during the break. We talked about the Crimea and the conflict in Crimea, and when we spoke about the heroes of this conflict in Crimea, and we spoke about Mr. Dobrodiev's role, Mr. Kiselyov's, the main propaganda man. And all conflicts are now spilling into the information wars. We're seeing this every day. And I think that we are seeing this information wars ranging in the Russian informational space. This conflict in the Ukraine, both parties, both the adversaries were calling each other names. They were calling each other fascists. The Russian propaganda machine was using the words like Bandera men and the Nazis and the fascists, and the Western Ukraine and Kiev were giving the same names to the pro-Russians. Could you comment the thought of Francis Fukuyama's comment in 1992 in the End of History book? He said that there are two types of states, the states in the historical paradigm and those which live in the post-historical paradigm, the countries which have evolved into this postmodern era to which he ascribed to the Western countries, and the rest of the world still lives in the historical or under the historical paradigm paradigm. Could you make such a distinction today? And would you put Russia into any of these groups? One other question, last question of the session, please. Yeah, Yegor Viktorov, alumnus of 2009. I just have a couple of observations to make. We are seeing an abundance of information. It's excessively abundant. And every person, and the second statement, every person is trying to find justifications for his or her picture of the world. And these facts are neutral, or can be neutral. The propaganda men try to give more coloring to the images. And I think that one should be paying less attention to the words, because the words can be interpreted. Words can well be, it's just words, and as Hamlet said, but rather on the deeds. The chaos in the internet is, according to many observers, a self-organizing structure. If one take a group of mobsters and put these mobsters into a sports hall, then these people would become a structure. Thus, chaos may well tend to self-organization. I thank Mr. Kolesnikov for his comment about the personal responsibility. If every person assumes the responsibility for himself or herself, and if he or she is strong enough to assume the responsibility for his or her family, that's all that we may require from a man.
The entire session and answer all your questions, including the end of history.
I think Zach posed the right question there, and I'm pretty sure that a consensus has emerged about the internet. In its sum, in its totality, it is just simply a reflection of human nature, and I think its effect on any crisis or any future division between nations is going to be neutral. It's a perfect machine for spreading rumors. It's also a very fine machine for citizen bloggers giving us news that possibly news organizations cannot, but it's also a great mess of ignorance and folly and rage. And I think that it was a very well-made point that people go to the internet to confirm their own opinions. I'm still struck, as I said earlier, by the prevailing mood of pessimism. It's very, very strong. It's the thing I will take back when people ask me, how are people here evaluating what's happening in their space? I think it's quite alarming, the extent to which you reflect a pressure, a gathering pressure, and therefore an emphasis on the importance of meetings like this. We have an extraordinary cacophony of voices and analysis in the West about what's going on. In a sense, I don't really go to the internet for definitions of the Ukrainian crisis. I would rather read reporters. Suddenly one now craves the long experience of the people who will lose shoe leather, who've got feet on the ground, who have been to other crises, who can compare and contrast, who bring a historical sense. I don't find that in the citizen bloggers. So, again, we might all be amazed in a year's time. This is all blown away. The threat of financial sanctions. Maybe someone would whisper in Putin's ear the line, the Rubicon is not crossed, and we can barely remember that we were so anxious. I really hope that's the case, and we can get back to discussing the vitality of cultures without this overwhelming sense of pressure and anxiety and pessimism.
Thank you. Thank you to Ian, to Zach, to all of our panelists, and to you. That was the right question.
But that Ivanov.
Коллеги, час ужин, в 9 начинается презентация. В 9, не позже. У нас изменения в программе.